What we believe about God is revealed not only in what we say, but in how we speak about people. Not what we say we believe, not the theology we can explain, not the scriptures we can quote, but the way we talk about immigrants, the way we talk about the poor, the way we talk about LGBTQ plus people, the way we talk about race, gender, religion, power, safety, borders, money, and belonging. Because here's the thing, spirituality is not just what happens when we close our eyes, light a candle, meditate, pray, or read sacred texts. Spirituality is also what happens when we open our eyes and look at the world we are creating together. If I say God is love, but I support systems that deny people dignity, something is out of alignment. If I say we are all made in the image of God, but I only recognize that image in people who look like me, believe like me, vote like me, or worship like me, or love like me, then I have not fully understood what I am saying. Today we are talking about God in public life, not partisan politics, not political talking points, but the deeper spiritual question beneath it all. What kind of world becomes possible when we remember that no one is outside the circle of divine belonging? Welcome to Seminary Outsider, the podcast where we explore the sacred beyond the walls of traditional religion and translate spiritual insight into personal transformation. I'm your host, Devin, and today's episode is called God in Public Life. In the last episode, Original Perfection, we explored the idea that our deepest truth is not brokenness, shame, or deficiency, but divine origin. We talked about what it means to begin the human story with sacredness rather than sinfulness. We reflected on the image and likeness of God, the garden within, and the possibility that transformation is not about becoming worthy, but remembering the worth that was already placed within us. Today, we are extending that conversation outward, because if original perfection is true for me, then it also has to be true for you. And if it is true for you, then it has to be true for the person I struggle to understand. It has to be true for the person society has pushed to the margins. It has to be true for the person whose existence makes people uncomfortable. It has to be true for the person who has been called illegal, dangerous, sinful, inferior, disposable, unworthy, or other. So today I want to sit with 3 ideas that can help us think differently about spirituality, justice, and responsibility. First, the myth of separation, and how justice begins when we recognize divine oneness. Second, the illusion of scarcity, and how fear convinces us there is not enough life, safety, dignity, or abundance to go around. And third, the hands of God, and why waiting on God to fix human-made problems may actually be a misunderstanding of how the divine moves in the world. So, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's begin. When we talk about spirituality, many people immediately think of private practices: prayer, meditation, journaling, reading sacred texts, going inward. And I want to be clear, all those things matter. Inner work matters, silence matters, prayer matters, contemplation matters. The private life of the soul matters deeply. But if our spirituality only lives in private, then eventually it becomes disconnected from the world. And that is dangerous, because spirituality that never touches how we treat people can become a hiding place. It can become a way of feeling holy without becoming more loving. It can become a way of feeling enlightened without becoming more just. It can become a way of saying beautiful things about God while ignoring the suffering of God's creation. So I want to begin with a simple metaphysical truth. We are not separate. We appear separate. We have different bodies, different names, different stories, different cultures, different identities, different histories, and different experiences. And those differences matter. I do not want to erase them or flatten them. But beneath the diversity of human expression, there is one divine life moving through all of us, one source, one sacred ground, one animating presence, one ocean expressing itself through many waves. That image is helpful to me. Each wave is unique. One wave may be large, another may be small, one may crash loudly against the shore, another may move softly. One may rise in one part of the ocean, another somewhere far away. But no wave is separate from the ocean, and no wave can claim to be more ocean than another wave. That is how I understand human beings metaphysically. We are individualized expressions of the divine. Different expressions, yes, but not separate from the same source. And this matters because so much of our social and political life is built on the illusion of separation. We are taught to divide the world into us and them, insiders and outsiders, deserving and undeserving, pure and impure, safe and dangerous, saved and lost, normal and abnormal, citizen and stranger, human and less than human. And once we accept that separation is real, it becomes very easy to justify harm because if I can convince myself that you are fundamentally other than me, then I can excuse myself from caring about what happens to you. If I can convince myself that your suffering has nothing to do with me, then I do not have to respond. And if I can convince myself that your dignity is negotiable, then I can participate in systems that diminish you and still call myself spiritual. This is why hateful rhetoric is never just political, it is spiritual. When we use language that strips people of dignity, when we mock people's identity, when we reduce entire communities to threats, stereotypes, or problems to be solved, we are participating in a spiritual era. And that era is the belief that there is an other outside the circle of divine belonging. But from the perspective of divine oneness, there is no such thing. There is no person outside of God. There is no community beyond the reach of sacred worth. There is no body that does not carry divine imprint. There is no identity that places someone outside the field of holy concern. Now, I know some people may hear that and immediately get nervous because they may think, well, does that mean we never hold people accountable? Does that mean anything goes? Does that mean we ignore harm? No, not at all. Divine recognition does not erase accountability. In fact, it deepens it. Because if I recognize the divine in you, then I cannot allow you to be harmed. And if I recognize the divine in the person causing harm, then I also cannot abandon them to their worst impulses. Justice at its deepest level is not revenge. Justice is the restoration of right relationship. Justice is what love looks like when love refuses to cooperate with dehumanization. Justice is what oneness looks like when oneness becomes embodied in policies, practices, language, systems, and communities. This is why spirituality and justice cannot be separated. If God is the ground of all being, then how we organize life together matters. If every person carries divine image, then housing matters, healthcare matters, education matters, immigration matters, racial justice matters, gender justice matters, economic justice matters, religious freedom matters, safety matters, belonging matters. Because these are not merely political issues, they are human issues. And because they are human issues, they are spiritual issues. Here is where I think many of us have inherited a limited view of spirituality. We were taught that spirituality is mostly about the individual soul. Am I saved? Am I forgiven? Am I praying enough? Am I pure enough? Am I making the right personal choices? And again, the personal matters. I believe deeply in inner transformation, but there's a problem when spirituality becomes so individualized that we lose sight of the collective. Because the question is not only, is my soul well? The question is also, am I participating in a world where other people can be well? That question changes everything. It means I cannot talk about peace while ignoring policies that create fear. I cannot talk about love while excusing rhetoric that humiliates people. I cannot talk about divine image while supporting systems that treat certain lives as dispensable. I cannot talk about abundance while defending conditions that keep people trapped in poverty. I cannot talk about unity while benefiting from division. And at some point, our spirituality has to become honest enough to ask, who is being excluded from the circle of my compassion? Who have I been taught to fear? Who have I been taught to blame? Who have I been taught not to see? And let's be honest, this is not easy work because separation is not only something out there in society, it also lives inside of us. It lives in the assumptions we inherited. It lives in the discomfort we feel around difference. It lives in the quick judgments we make before we even realize we are making them. It lives in the stories we were told about certain neighborhoods, certain religions, certain bodies, certain accents, certain identities, certain political groups, certain ways of being human. And spiritual growth requires us to bring light to those places, not to shame ourselves, but to become conscious. Because as we talked about in the last episode, light is awareness. And awareness is where creation begins. So part of the spiritual work of justice is allowing the light to reveal where separation has been operating in us. Where have I confused my comfort with truth? Where have I mistaken familiarity for righteousness? Where have I allowed fear to shape my theology? Where have I treated my cultural assumptions as if they were divine law? Where have I failed to recognize God because God came to me in a form that I was taught to reject? The last question is important because sometimes the divine comforts us through the very people we were taught to exclude. Sometimes God expands our theology by showing up in the person our religion told us to fear. Sometimes God heals our imagination by moving through voices we were told not to trust. Sometimes God breaks open our heart through communities we once judged from a distance. And when that happens, we have a choice. We can protect the old boundary or we can expand. We can cling to the myth of separation or we can move into divine recognition. And by divine recognition, I mean the practice of looking at another person and saying, you are not outside of God. You are not outside of dignity. You are not outside of sacred worth. You are not other than me in the deepest sense. Now, that does not mean we agree with everyone. It does not mean we collapse our differences. It does not mean we pretend harm is not real. It means we refuse to dehumanize. It means we refuse to build our identity on superiority. It means we refuse to confuse our group, our nation, our religion, our race, our gender, our class, or our perspective with the fullness of God. Because the moment I believe God belongs more to me than to you, I have already stepped into illusion. And that illusion is the beginning of injustice. So the first invitation today is this. Pay attention to where you have been taught to see separation. Pay attention to where you have inherited an us versus them imagination. Pay attention to the people your world has trained you not to recognize, because justice begins with recognition. Before policy, before activism, before public statements, before institutional change, there is a spiritual seeing, a seeing that says there is one life here, there is one source here, there is one divine presence expressing through many forms. And when one part of the body suffers, the whole body is affected. One of the reasons separation is so powerful is because it usually travels with another illusion: scarcity. The belief that there is not enough money, not enough safety, not enough opportunity, not enough housing, not enough jobs, not enough compassion, not enough belonging, not enough room, not enough dignity, not enough God. And when people are afraid there is not enough, they start guarding what they have. They start asking, who is taking from me? They start looking for someone to blame. They start believing that another person's liberation is their loss. Another person's rights are their threat. Another person's safety means they have less safety. Another person's flourishing somehow diminishes their own. Scarcity is one of the great spiritual distortions of human consciousness. Now, I want to be careful here. When I say scarcity is an illusion, I am not denying that people experience real lack. People are hungry, people are unhoused, people are underpaid, people are drowning in medical debt, people are working multiple jobs and still cannot make ends meet. People are living in communities where resources have been intentionally withheld. So when I say scarcity is an illusion, I do not mean people are imagining their suffering. I mean scarcity is not the truth of God. Scarcity is not divine design. Scarcity is often the result of human systems built around fear, greed, extraction, domination, and unequal distribution. In other words, the lack people experience is real, but lack is not ultimate reality. Metaphysically, God is unlimited source, infinite possibility, creative intelligence, life without exhaustion, love without depletion. The divine does not operate from panic. God is not somewhere anxiously calculating whether there will be enough dignity to go around, enough grace, enough beauty, enough belonging, enough healing, enough light, enough life. Source is not scarce. So when we build societies around scarcity, we are not reflecting divine truth. We are reflecting fear. And fear can be very persuasive. Fear says, protect your own. Fear says, there's not enough for everyone. Fear says, if they gain, you lose. Fear says, compassion is dangerous. Fear says, generosity will leave you empty. Fear says, you better hoard power because if you share it, you may not survive. And once fear becomes the organizing principle, injustice begins to look reasonable. Greed begins to look responsible. Exclusion begins to look practical. Cruelty begins to look like strength, and policies that harm vulnerable people are defended as necessary. But spiritual metaphysics invites us to ask a deeper question. What would change if we actually believe there was enough? Not enough for greed, not enough for endless corruption, and not enough for some people to hoard while others suffer, but enough for every person to live with dignity. Enough food, enough shelter, enough education, enough care, enough safety, enough opportunity, enough belonging, enough access to the conditions that allow a human life to flourish. That is not fantasy. That is spiritual responsibility. Because if we believe in an unlimited source, then our task is not to hoard life. Our task is to become channels through which life flows. Think about that word channel. A channel does not create the water. It allows the water to move, and perhaps that is part of our calling. We do not create the abundance of God, but we can either block it or allow it. We can create systems where resources pool around a few, or we can create systems where life circulates. We can organize around competition, or we can organize around cooperation. We can build walls of fear, or we can build tables of shared flourishing. And I know that can sound idealistic, but I want to bring it down to earth because abundance is not just a mindset. It is not just saying affirmations in the mirror. It is not pretending everything is fine when people are suffering. Abundance becomes real when it shapes behavior. It becomes real when people with power ask, how do we make sure everyone has what they need? It becomes real when communities choose care over neglect. It becomes real when leaders choose long term human flourishing over short term gain. It becomes real when we stop treating poverty as a personal failure and start asking what kind of society produces it. It becomes real when we stop treating people as burdens and start recognizing them as bearers of divine life. This is where politics becomes spiritual because every policy carries an imagination. Every budget carries a theology. Every law carries a belief about whose life matters. Every institution reflects some idea of what human beings are worth. So when we ask political questions, we are also asking spiritual questions. Who do we believe deserves care? Who do we believe deserves protection? Who do we believe deserves rest? Who do we believe deserves a second chance? Who do we believe deserves to belong? Who do we believe deserves life abundantly? And here's where I want to challenge us gently but honestly. Many of us say we believe in abundance, but we live from scarcity. We say God is our source, but we panic when others receive what we thought belonged only to us. We say love is limitless, but we ration compassion. We say grace is amazing, but we become suspicious when grace is extended to people we do not approve of. We say there is room at the table, but we quietly hope the table does not get too crowded. That is human. I am not saying that to condemn anyone. I am saying it because the scarcity narrative is deeply embedded in us. We inherit it from families, we inherit it from institutions, we inherit it from capitalism, we inherit it from religious systems that taught us God's love is conditional. We inherit it from social hierarchies that told us someone else had to be beneath us in order for us to feel secure. So, part of spiritual growth is noticing scarcity when it happens, not just in our bank accounts, but in our imagination. Where do I believe there is not enough? Where do I feel threatened by someone else's freedom? Where do I confuse equality with loss? Where do I believe compassion has to be rationed? Where do I secretly think some people having more dignity means I have less? That is deep work because scarcity often hides beneath respectability. It hides beneath practicality. It hides beneath phrases like, we have to be realistic. And yes, we do have to be realistic, but realism without spiritual imagination often becomes resignation. It says, this is just how the world works. Some people will always be poor. Some people will always be excluded. Some people will always be disposable. Some communities will always suffer. Some children will always go without. Some people will always be pushed outside. But spiritual consciousness refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. It says, maybe this is how the world has been organized, but it is not the only way the world can be. That is the power of tapping into unlimited source. It does not make us naive, it makes us creative. It allows us to imagine beyond the systems we have inherited. It allows us to ask what else is possible. What would housing look like if we believed shelter was connected to dignity? What would education look like if we believed every student carried divine potential? What would healthcare look like if we believed bodies were sacred? What would imagination look like if we believed borders should never erase humanity? What would public speech sound like if we believed every word either honors or obscures the divine in another? What would leadership look like if we believed power was for service and not domination? These questions matter because the world we see is shaped by the consciousness we bring to it. If we bring separation and scarcity, we will create systems of exclusion and competition. If we bring oneness and abundance, we can begin creating systems of dignity and shared flourishing. That does not happen overnight. It does not happen through good intentions alone. It requires courage, it requires policy, it requires organizing, it requires accountability, it requires imagination, it requires spiritual maturity. But it begins with the recognition that scarcity is not the final truth. Fear is not the final truth. Greed is not the final truth. Exclusion is not the final truth. The truth is that life wants to live. Love wants to move. Source wants to flow. And we are invited to participate in that flow. There's a phrase many of us have heard in religious spaces: God will make a way. And I believe that. I really do. I believe there is a wisdom, a presence, a creative intelligence that can move in ways we can't always predict. I believe grace can surprise us. I believe doors can open. I believe healing can emerge. I believe the divine can meet us in the wilderness and make streams in the desert. But I also think we sometimes use spiritual language to avoid responsibility. We say, God will make a way, when God may be asking us to become the way. We say, God will provide, while ignoring the fact that we may be the means through which provision is supposed to come. We say, God is in control, as if that means we are exempt from action. We say, I'll pray for you, when what is actually needed is advocacy, resources, protection, courage, or change. Prayer matters, but prayer is not a substitute for responsibility. Spiritual trust is not passivity. Faith is not an excuse to stand still while people are harmed. From a metaphysical perspective, we are expressions of the divine. That means God does not only act upon the world from somewhere outside of it, God also acts through consciousness, through compassion, through courage, through bodies, through hands, through voices, through policies, through art, through protests, through leadership, through care, through the ordinary choices of people who decide to become available to love. In other words, we are the hands of God. That phrase can sound poetic, but I want us to take it seriously. If someone is hungry, the hands of God may look like food. If someone is lonely, the hands of God may look like presence. If someone is being targeted, the hands of God may look like protection. If a community is being harmed by policy, the hands of God may look like advocacy. If hateful rhetoric is spreading, the hands of God may look like a voice willing to tell the truth. If someone's dignity is being denied, the hands of God may look like people who refuse to look away. This is where spirituality becomes embodied, not just believed, embodied. And embodiment is something we talked about in the previous episode. It is one thing to believe you are made in the image and likeness of God. It is another thing to live from that truth. Today, I want to extend that idea. It is one thing to believe others are made in the image and likeness of God. It is another thing to build a world that treats them that way. That is embodiment. That is where theology becomes ethics. That is where metaphysics becomes action. That is where spiritual insight becomes personal and collective transformation. And I want to say this carefully. When we talk about socio-political responsibility, some people immediately get overwhelmed. They think, I cannot fix the world. And that is true. You cannot fix the entire world by yourself. You are not being asked to do that. but you are being asked to become conscious of the part of the world that is yours to touch. Your workplace, your classroom, your family, your community, your vote, your voice, your resources, your relationships, your leadership, your language, your attention, your daily choices. The question is not, can I do everything? The question is, what is mine to do? That question is spiritually grounding because it keeps us from both despair and ego. Despair says, the problem is too big, so nothing I do matters. Ego says, I alone must carry the whole problem. But spiritual responsibility says, I am part of the body. I will do the part that is mine. And your part may look different in different seasons. Sometimes your part is speaking. Sometimes your part is listening. Sometimes your part is learning. Sometimes your part is giving. And sometimes your part is organizing. Sometimes your part is creating. Sometimes your part is protecting rest so you can stay in the work without being consumed by it. Sometimes your part is changing how you talk around the dinner table. Sometimes your part is challenging a harmful assumption in a meeting. Sometimes your part is refusing to laugh at a dehumanizing joke. And sometimes your part is supporting leaders and organizations already doing the work. And sometimes your part is examining where you have benefited from systems you did not create, but still have a responsibility to transform. There is no single way to be faithful to justice, but there is no faithful spirituality that makes peace with dehumanization. Let me say that again. There is no faithful spirituality that makes peace with dehumanization. Because once we accept that some people can be treated as less than fully sacred, we have stepped away from divine recognition. And I know this can be uncomfortable, especially when the people being dehumanized are people we have been taught to judge or fear or dismiss or see as threats. But that discomfort may be part of the invitation. Spiritual growth is not always soothing. Sometimes it disrupts us. Sometimes it asks us to repent. And I do not mean that in a shame-based way. I mean repentance in the deeper sense of turning, changing direction, changing consciousness, changing the way we see, changing the way we participate. Maybe repentance in this moment means turning away from silence. Maybe it means turning away from inherited prejudice. Maybe it means turning away from a theology that made exclusion feel holy. Maybe it means turning away from the comfort of neutrality, because neutrality is not always neutral. Sometimes neutrality protects the status quo. Sometimes neutrality allows harm to continue uninterrupted. Sometimes neutrality is the language privilege uses to avoid choosing love in public. Now, I am not saying every person needs to post about every issue, speak on every topic, or perform outrage to prove they care. That can become its own kind of ego. But I am saying that spiritual integrity requires alignment. If we believe in oneness, our lives should move towards connection. If we believe in abundance, our choices should move towards shared flourishing. If we believe we are the hands of God, our spirituality should move towards embodied compassion. And embodied compassion is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is local. Sometimes it is administrative. Sometimes it is relational. Sometimes it is as simple as asking, who is not being considered in this decision? That question alone can be holy. Who is not being considered? Who is missing from the table? Who will be impacted but has not been heard? Who is being asked to carry the cost of someone else's comfort? Who is being described as a problem instead of a person? Who is being protected? Who is being sacrificed? Those are spiritual questions, and they are also leadership questions. They are community questions. They are policy questions. They are human questions. This is why I do not believe we can separate our spirituality from the current socio-political climate. The world is not an interruption to spiritual life. The world is the place where spiritual life becomes visible. It is easy to talk about love in the abstract. It is harder to love actual people and actual systems with actual consequences. It is easy to talk about unity when unity costs us nothing. It is harder to practice unity when it requires us to challenge the divisions that benefit us. It is easy to talk about faith when faith stays private. It is harder to let faith shape how we show up in public. But that is the invitation. Not perfection, not saviorism, not burnout, not self-righteousness, but availability. Availability to be used by love, availability to become a channel of justice, availability to let the divine move through our hands, our words, our choices, and our courage. So maybe the question is not, when will God fix this? Maybe the question is, where is God trying to move through me? Where is God asking me to see differently? Where is God asking me to speak more honestly? Where is God asking me to stop cooperating with fear? Where is God asking me to use my influence? Where is God asking me to protect someone else's dignity? Where is God asking me to help build a world that reflects the truth I say I believe? Because if God is love, then love must become social. If God is justice, then justice must become embodied. If God is abundance, then abundance must become shared. If God is oneness, then oneness must become how we organize life together. That is God in public life. Not God as a mascot for a party, not God as a weapon in a cultural war, not God as a slogan we attach to our preferences, but God as the living reality that calls us beyond separation, beyond scarcity, and beyond passivity. God as the presence that says, there is no other, there is enough, and you are not here just to watch, you are here to participate. As we come to a close, let's gather the threads. Today, we explored what it means to understand God in public life, not as partisan performance, not as religious domination, but as a sacred responsibility to create a world that reflects divine truth. First, we talked about the myth of separation. We named the divisions based on race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexuality, religion, class, nationality, or any other human category are often shaped by ego and fear when they are used to create otherness. Difference is real and beautiful, but separation is an illusion. At the deepest level, we are waves in one ocean, expressions of one source, members of one sacred body. Then we talked about the illusion of scarcity. We acknowledged that lack is real in people's lived experience, but it is not the truth of God. Scarcity becomes dangerous when it teaches us to hoard, exclude, compete, and fear one another. But when we remember our connection to unlimited source, we are invited to become channels of abundance, creating conditions where everyone has what they need to live with dignity. And finally, we talked about the hands of God. We challenge the idea that spirituality is passive. We are not simply waiting for God to repair what human beings have created. We are invited to participate in the repair through our compassion, our policies, our leadership, our courage, our relationships, and our daily choices. The divine moves through us. So here is the question I want to leave you with. Where have you been tempted to see someone else as other? And what would change this week if you practice divine recognition instead? Not just as a thought, not just as a belief, but as a choice, a word, an action, a conversation, a correction, a moment of courage, a moment of compassion. Because spiritual life is not about returning to God within ourselves. It is about recognizing God in one another, especially in the people we were taught not to see. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to Seminary Outsider wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you know someone who is wrestling with how to connect spirituality, justice, and personal transformation in a more expansive way, share this episode with them. I'm Devin, and this has been Seminary Outsider, the podcast where we explore the sacred beyond the walls of traditional religion and translate spiritual insight into personal transformation. May you remember that there is no other. May you trust that there is enough, and may you allow your life to become one more place where God's love takes form in the world. Until next time, goodbye.